Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here. It is time for my 2025 LEC Spring Split Primer and Power Rankings video. It's time to get back into the swing of things for the LEC. We've already done this video for the LPL and for the NACL over in North America. If you're interested in either of those videos, as well as my first recap of the LPL, the first kind of half of their placement stage, you can check out the playlist up on the iCard that has every video of the Spring Split so far on this channel. But it's finally time to get into some LEC action. I know a lot of people in the comments have been asking when this video is coming out. Well, it's coming out right now, a couple of days before the start of the split. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What do you expect from a lot of these teams going into Spring Split? I will be giving a lot of opinions in this video, as I basically always do. I'll be talking about, some teams that I think are better than expectation right now, and some players that I think are better or maybe worse than expectation right now. Of course, we'll be power ranking every single team, every single player in their role, all the normal stuff for these primer videos. So let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. But I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the start of the video. There is a lot to go over. Like I said, the format of this video is that we will be going over every single team, all 10 teams in the LEC, talking about the things that I think they're good at, the things that I think they're bad at, and where you can kind of expect to see them land. We will be going from number 10 in my personal power rankings to number 1. Some of these have shifted from the end of last split, but for the most part, there is definitely still a lot of winter taken into account. Of course, new format, for those of you who haven't been kind of keeping up with what the LEC is doing. It's no longer just the, 3 weeks of best of ones going into this big 8-team tournament bracket where you go into best of 3s and then eventually into best of 5s. Now it's best of 3s in the regular season, quote unquote, a 7-week regular season, something that's going to be a lot more familiar to Eastern fans if they've been watching the LPL the past couple of years or the LCK the last couple of years, or alternatively to long-time, LEC, like EU LCS fans. This is a very classic format where it's just kind of a best of 3 regular season that bleeds into a top 6 playoff. I like this format a lot. This is still my favorite format to go back to, even though it seems like League wants to do everything to move away from it. But, best of 3s are the way to go, with Full Fearless basically fully implemented at this point across the world, and that definitely favors some teams over the others, and I'll kind of talk about that as we go through. But for the most part, we'll be going from number 10 to number 1 in my power rankings. I will also be power ranking each player in their position, where I personally grade them from number 1 to number 10. The big caveat, of course, at the start of this video that I basically always have to give is that not every position is created equal. Some positions are just better and deeper than other positions. You can't just say, oh, the number 8 jungler is the same as the number 8 AD carry. That's not really how it ends up working out. There's obviously a lot more nuance to a discussion than that, and so obviously let my words explain my thoughts and feelings on each of these players. If you have a major disagreement, that's totally fine, but if you think a player is too high or too low in these rankings in terms of their individual positions, you gotta let me know who you think they should be above. It's all well and good to say that, X player deserves to be a top 3 or a top 4 mid laner, but if 5 or 6 players deserve to be a top 3 or 4 mid laner, like, obviously that's impossible to do. There's gotta be some sort of break-off point, and I think I've tried to draw that as best as I can. Obviously, I will explain the instances where it feels like the player's number is not representative of how good they are, both in either a good or a bad way, but we'll get into those individuals as we go throughout the video. But with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the actual content. Of course, going from number 10 to number 1 means we get to start with my projected worst team in the entire league, and quite frankly, this should not be a surprise, although I did kind of deliberate on this a lot more than maybe other analysts are going to deliberate on it, but I ended up coming to probably the same conclusion as everybody else. Coming in at number 10 for me, it is going to be SK Gaming, the team that was pretty much by far the worst team in the LEC in the winter split. They did pick up a win towards the end of the regular season, but again, for the most part, you were looking at a team that was really awful and really hopeless throughout basically the entirety of winter, and quite frankly, I don't think they got better going into spring. I certainly think they made changes in the hopes that they can bring something back, bring some continuity to this team, but at the end of the day, I just don't know if they have enough talent. I think their solo lanes are bad. I think they maybe have the worst player in the league right now. I think their upgrades aren't upgrades enough, and I think one role is a downgrade, as you could see in terms of my positional rankings, and we'll kind of go over all that. But of course, let's go over what you're seeing on the screen first and foremost. Of course, at the top, you'll see SK Gaming, the team name, the number next to them, the 10 in this case is where I personally power rank them, from number 1 to number 10, and in brackets, in parentheses next to it is going to be how they have moved from my preseason rankings to now. So from the beginning of winter, before they played any games, I had SK at number 8 going into the year. They are obviously much worse than that. You can see how they finished in winter winter. Right below it, they went 1-8 in the regular season. They did not qualify for the playoffs. They ended up finishing in 9th, which means that they were one of the first teams out. They did not get to play any best of threes, and so nothing to talk about there. Of course, we'll kind of put their playoff performances in that little parenthesis bracket when applicable, once we start getting to the teams that actually did make the top 8. And then, of course, you can see the 5 starters at the bottom. The number below each of the starters' names is going to indicate where I personally power rank them in their individual role. So for GIANTX, I have him as the number 9 top laner. For Reeker, I have him as the number 10 mid laner, you know, that kind of stuff. And then again, in the parentheses, how that has changed from preseason to now, whether they have grown or fallen in terms of my expectations. A new underneath any of the player numbers is just going to indicate that the player is joining the team now, that this is not the same player that they had in the winter split, and we'll go over those when we get to them. Of course, the last thing to say is any asterisk next to a player's name, like Loopy in the support position, just denotes that they are an import and that they are taking up an import slot. But that should be everything out of the way so we can finally start talking about SK Gaming. Their lineup is looking like GIANTX in the top lane, Bukata in the jungle, Reeker in the mid lane, Kadui at AD carry, and Loopy at support. Obviously, they did make some changes going into the offseason. They're really the team that made the most changes, and certainly they needed it because they needed to change things up. But I really don't think they made the right changes. They had 2 good players in the winter split, Isma and Rahel. I think both of them were playing, you know, generally fine, maybe below expectations. Rahel definitely was playing below expectations, but Isma was basically everything that he has been over the course of his entire pro career, everything that he was for SK leading up to this year. And so, yeah, I wasn't really surprised by that. But the issues on this team were, the solo laners were unplayable. GIANTX was, for the most part, one of the worst players in the entire league. The only reason he doesn't come in at number 10 is because I do think there was a top laner that was even more inconsistent than him in terms of the 1v1s. And then, you know, you have Reeker in the mid lane, who might just be the single worst player in the LEC right now. It reminds me so much of Seiken from last year, but you're also keeping Loopy down in the bot lane, a player that, as far as I'm aware, you only brought in to give Rahel somebody that he was familiar with to play in the bot lane. Loopy was miserable. We kind of knew he wasn't going to be very good. That was a good take that we had in the offseason on this channel, was that Loopy's tape is just not great, and despite his synergy with Rahel, I think he was going to be a massive downgrade, and that's exactly what he was in the support position. But now you're even getting rid of Rahel, the player that you brought Loopy in for, and now you just have the worst support in the league with basically no synergy on the rest of this team anyways. It's a very, very weird setup here for SK that I'm really not that big of a fan of, and unfortunately, all of that comes down to me saying, like, I do actually like the new additions. I like the new players. I like Bukata. I like Kadui. I think that they are solid enough players at the LEC level. Kadui in particular has really deserved a call-up for a while. Bukata is a very versatile player who does a lot of things really well. His Maokai is ridiculous, but the core problems of SK are still here. You didn't fix those at all in the offseason, so we can kind of talk about it here. Again, starting off with kind of the new additions, I want to start with Kadui because I think he is the one that's going to receive more, I guess, hype coming in here into 2025 because he was on that BDS Academy team with Reeker, with GIANTX that really succeeded last year, of course, with Skewmond and Paris that, you know, they're also succeeding, or at least kind of succeeding right now in the LEC. You know, Kadui was the last piece of that team that didn't get an LEC offer at the beginning of the year. He finally does come in to join his former teammates. But let's be real here, like Reeker and GIANTX were not good at all. They were some of the weaker players in the entire LEC in the winter split, and you're hoping Kadui can come in and not just fix the bot lane, like not just upgrade that duo lane, which I don't think he's going to be able to do, but also try to get Reeker and GIANTX back on track, and that's another thing that I just don't think he's going to be able to do. I like Kadui. I think he's an interesting prospect coming up, but there's no real way for me to rate him above like the number 9 AD carry in the LEC without having seen him play a game. I think that there are a lot of things to like. He's very versatile as an ADC. I think that's something that him and Bukata both have, is versatility. They can come in and kind of play a bunch of different styles. You can play for multiple different lanes. He's very adept at playing things like Jhin and Ashe and Ezreal and playing weak side down on the bot lane, but he can also play Zeri really well. He can also play, you know, Jinx really well. He is a hyper carry player if he needs to do that. I think there aren't a ton of AD carries that can play all of those champions at relatively similar levels, and I think Kadui just does it really nicely. But again, I just don't like the bot lane because Loopy is still here, and quite frankly, Loopy is probably the second worst player in the entire LEC right now. I shouldn't say that, because the worst player we'll get to isn't on this team. But Reeker, Loopy, they're 2 of the bottom 3. I'll just say that. They both are pretty atrocious. Loopy was even worse than I was expecting him to be, and I already thought he was going to be a pretty big negative for SK Gaming. I thought the bot lane was going to be fine because Rahel was really good, but now you take Rahel's mechanical ceiling out of there. Loopy is the weakest mechanical support in the entire league. It's not even remotely close, and now he's playing with somebody he's never played with before. 4, easy number 10. Like, there's genuinely no way you could convince me that he should be higher than number 10. There's no other support in the league whose floor is lower than Loopy, and I feel very confident in saying that. I think you could say a similar thing for both Reeker and GIANTX. Reeker comes in as the number 10 mid laner for me. Again, very similar to Seiken from last year. It feels like he just isn't going to be able to make that jump mechanically speaking. Now, for Seiken, it was a little bit different. Seiken, it was all mental. It was all confidence. You could see that he got blasted in his first couple of games, like in week 1 or week 2 in the winter split. And then he just like stopped trying to win. He was giving over resources basically for free. He was accepting the fact that he was going to go down 20 CS and he was just going to hope not to die over and over again. Like, he had just completely given up. And I don't think Reeker has done that. I just think the problem for Reeker is his mechanics are not good enough for this level. He is a smart player who understands where he needs to be, but he cannot survive 1v1 in lane against the best mid laners in Europe. Like, he just can't do it. It's clear that he just doesn't have the skill to be able to do that. Maybe this gets better over the course of the year. I would be surprised. I'm really out on Reeker right now. Again, even though he is a smart player, he just doesn't really seem to have the skill to be able to keep up with guys like Caps and guys like Vladi and guys like Jojo Pune and Humanoid and Nuke, and like, there's so many Jackies, there's so many mechanically talented mid laners in the LEC. Reeker's just not going to be able to survive that, and so for me, he still comes in at number 10. GIANTX, I think, is an interesting case because he is still an okay laner, especially when he gets good lane matchups on the top side. Like, there were moments that he was okay in the 1v1. He was able to generate some leads, but he is such an abysmal team fighter, or at least he was in the winter split, that it's really hard to say that that's valuable in any conceivable way. You know, GIANTX in most cases would be the number 10 top laner. I think there's one that was even more inconsistent than him, but again, at least he's able to win in good matchups in lane, which I don't think every single top laner is able to do. And then, like I said, Bukata joining here in the jungle, he is a fun player to watch. I think watching him on KCB this past split in winter, I was really impressed with the way that he was able to play with the rest of that team, but that team felt so cohesive, like, as a unit. It was really difficult to pull one singular player out of their performances once they got into, you know, major competition, once they actually started, like, taking things a lot more seriously. Bukata was really excellent, specifically on things like the Maokai. He really stood out in a positive way there. He's played a lot of Sejuani, he's played a lot of Vi, and we know he can be a facilitator, but we've seen him on carries as well. The Viego was something that also stood out in a very positive way for me when going and watching a lot of the tape. Overall, I think he is a good addition. I think he's a jungler that I would be interested in, kind of similar to how I felt about Linsauce back in, you know, a couple of years ago. But that's not exactly the biggest success story. Like, I'm pretty out on Linsauce now that he's been in the LEC. Again, I think Bukata can turn into a really positive player. I just have a hard time believing it's going to be on this team. If both of your solo laners are going to be pretty consistently losing, if you need to give counterpick to the top side, and you have an AD carry that is good, but doesn't really feel like somebody that's going to come in and take over the game, and you have a horrible support along with him, it's just really difficult for me to imagine a world where SK breaks out without something going right for this team in terms of the players that went wrong. One of GIANTX, Reeker, and Loopy has to not be bottom 2 in their position, even if Bukata and Kadui are good. I just don't think they're going to have the, like, setup to be able to capitalize on that. You need to rely on the players that were awful in the winter split being at least average for this team, and I just have a really hard time believing that that's going to be the case for them. Again, anything can happen in the LEC. I'm certainly not counting them out entirely, but SK, after some deliberation, because there are some bad teams in the LEC, is going to be the team that sticks at number 10 in my power rankings. But then moving on to the team that I have 9th in my power rankings, the other team that I propose will be bottom 2 at the very least. Obviously, bottom 4 is kind of what you need to avoid now in the best of 3 stage, but still, you know, for posterity's sake, bottom 2 is not good. It's gonna be Rogue. I don't think anybody's surprised to see this team this low. I think the only shock is that I still have one of the players on this team rated fairly high, because I do still think Adam is really, really, really good on the top side. I just think the rest of this team is such an absolute disaster that it basically doesn't matter. As bad as SK was, at the end of the day, Rogue was the team that finished in 10th place in the winter split, and that should go to show you just how not good parts of this team were. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Adam in the top lane, Malrang in the jungle, Larson in the mid lane, Patrick at AD carry, and Execute at support. No other place to start here besides Adam, because I do want to get the conversation out of the way. I'm still an Adam defender. I'm still an Adam believer. Quite frankly, Adam was awesome in the winter split. He did so many great things on the top side of the map for this team. Their one game win that they had was basically a 1v9 from him, and even the games that they lost, he was winning lane super consistently. It's absurd how good he is as a player, and I get that there's a lot of off-season, or off-the-rift drama, not off-season, off-the-rift drama when it comes to Adam, and it's very difficult to imagine him getting back onto an actual exceptionally good team at any point in his career, but if you're specifically just talking about individual performances on the Rift, I can't rate him below like a top 3 or a top 4 top laner. Like at the absolute worst, he's up there, and he can compete with players like, you know, Broken Blade and Kana, who we will get to later. Mechanically speaking, he is on their level. He is going to make mistakes sometimes, and he does rely a bit more on counter pick than a lot of other top laners, which is why he does come in below those upper echelon guys. It's why he's not on the same tier as them in terms of me ranking a lot of these players, but Adam's skill level is there. Like, he has proven that over and over and over again. There's nothing else left to prove. I get that this team is bad, but if this team was good, Adam would be able to showcase his talents a lot more like he was able to do on BDS for so many years. The problem is not Adam. The problem is the rest of this team, and quite frankly, it's everybody on the rest of this team. The only other player that I think you could excuse in the winter split in terms of the performances that they put out was probably Malrang in the jungle, which is ironic because he is dropping quite a few spots here. I think a lot of junglers actually impressed me. I think someone like Bukata coming into the league, you know, just naturally pushes Malrang down because I don't think his ceiling is particularly high. I say he impressed me not because I thought he was particularly good for Rogue. I actually think he was not good, but because he didn't just AFK run it down, try to gank at level 3, level 4 every single game and just hope and pray that that ended up working out for them. That was obviously something that worked for Rogue when that was the meta multiple years ago when they were winning the LEC, but he went over to Brazil and was absolutely miserable for Kaboom in 2024. Like, I cannot understate just how awful he was in the CBLOL last year, and I thought he was going to be like a true detriment, like a truly awful player for this team in the same way that Loopy was really bad for SK Gaming. That was not the case. He was at least passable at times as a jungler. He was pretty patient, wasn't necessarily giving over a ridiculous amount of leads, still could be aggressive at times. He just didn't have the team around him to be able to do anything. It was everybody else on this team that really let them down. You know, Execute, I guess, was also kind of fine. Like, at the end of the day, he was basically exactly what we thought he was going to be. This was a guy who got benched in the LCK last year because he wasn't good enough. I get that he has a lot of reputation and prestige in the LEC when he was Junghoon playing on Astralis with Kabe for many years because he was such an aggressive player and he did have a lot of really good years, but that clearly seems to be behind him. I'm not sure if it's just for mental reasons or if it's for gameplay reasons, but at the end of the day, this team is always going to be bad if they have Larson and Patrick. Like, there is just simply no way I can imagine this team rising above a bottom 2 spot if these two play the way that they did in the winter split. We'll start with Patrick because his conversation's much easier. He was the single worst player in the LEC. It wasn't even remotely close. I know we talked about players like Reeker and Loopy, but Patrick was by far the worst player in the LEC. And in fact, in terms of a grade that I gave him, or like looking back on the tape and, you know, looking back on the stats that I track over the course of a lot of these splits to kind of come up with my player ratings, like, Patrick was the worst player that has ever graded out for me at the LEC level. There's never been a split as bad as Patrick's winter split. Now, Patrick's been an okay player in the past. In fact, he's been a top tier player in the past. He's been really good, but this has been a downward trajectory for quite a while now for Patrick. Even GIANTX was willing to let go after him being basically the franchise player for many years. He comes over here to Rogue and it just looks like it's going to be an absolute disaster. The only reason he still has a starting spot going into the spring split is because Rogue doesn't have any money. You know, there's obviously the rumor that just came out, I believe yesterday, that Navi is looking to buy this spot. If that happens, great. Patrick's going to be the first person out of this team, because if this team had any money to bring on a 6th player to replace him, they absolutely would, but they're not going to pay more than 5 players. So Patrick's going to have to stick around, and he's probably still going to be the worst AD carry in the league by a pretty large margin. And then you've got Larson, who is the franchise player for this organization in the mid lane, and talk about a player just getting worse and worse and worse. And I say that, but it's more of a player just getting more and more out of meta, not being able to keep up with the way that the game is evolving. The game has gotten faster, the game has gotten more skirmish heavy, it's gotten more aggressive, and Larson just cannot compete in that stratosphere. The only reason, again, that he comes in at number 8 is because he has some level of track record, and I don't think the bottom 2 mid laners are good. He comes in above Reeker, and you can probably guess the other mid laner that he comes in above at number 9, but Larson's not a good player. He's not somebody that's going to help out this team really in any conceivable way. And in fact, I think he probably just had the worst split of his entire career. It's really disappointing, but like the passive mentality, the let's just wait, let's try and scale up to 25, 30 minutes into the game, it just doesn't work anymore. And Larson is not flexible in any other way. He's going to pick Azir, he's going to pick Corki, and he's going to sit in the mid lane and hope and pray that he can get to the team fight stage. But even then, it's not like he's been electric in the team fight stage. It's the same thing that we talk about with Patrick, where Patrick is also a pretty passive aggressive laner. He's not somebody that really tries to take over the game. He wants to try to get to the team fight stage, and he just kind of gets bounced in lane because of it. He's constantly losing. Larsson's in a similar boat where his 1v1 skills are way worse than they were a couple of years ago when he was winning the LEC, and it's just not a good meta for him to be a team fight focused player, and he doesn't seem to be able to adapt when he does play things like Tristana. He's like historically bad at them, and so I just feel really bad about the carry duo here of Larsson and Patrick. I think it makes it basically impossible for Rogue to win games consistently, but at the end of the day, like the reason they come in above SK, the reason they're not number 10 in my rankings is they have Adam. Like, that is genuinely the only difference maker. I don't really believe in Malrang, I don't really believe in Execute, and I certainly don't believe in Larsson and Patrick, but Adam is a good enough player where I can imagine 1 or 2, game wins throughout the entire split just coming off of the back of him alone. I think he is good enough and mechanically talented enough to be able to do that. The problem is there is no supporting cast here. This is a one-man army. Every game that they win is likely going to be a 1v9 or at the very best, like a 3v7 with Adam, Malrang, and Execute, and, Larsson and Patrick just not getting in the way nearly enough. You're just not going to get any sort of consistent success from Rogue. I would be entirely stunned if that changed throughout the year, and quite frankly, if this was the number 10 team, I wouldn't be surprised, but I think the floor that Adam brings just in terms of winning games is more than SK has to offer, which is why they come in at number 9. Then moving on to number 8 in my power rankings, and this is where we kind of end off the teams that I think definitely still have a lot to prove for me. I think bottom 3 feels pretty locked in terms of where these power rankings are. That might not be the most popular opinion, but it's where I'm at, and number 8 for me is going to be Team Heretics. I'm still not really buying into this team in the same way that a lot of other people are, because I still think that their solo lane duo is very questionable. I think the good parts of this team are actually pretty solid, and there was a reason that they were able to win 3 games over the course of last split, but there was also a reason that they were clearly the worst team in the playoffs, that they were clearly the bottom team in the top 8. I absolutely do believe it's more of a bottom 3 than it is like a bottom 2 and then Heretics up with the other teams that are around like number 5 or 6 in the power rankings. I just don't really believe that that's where they're at right now. I think this team is still going to struggle a bit, even if they do still have upside. Like, there are ways to win games, and that's why they are coming in above the other 2 teams at the bottom. I just don't think it's going to be particularly consistent. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Karlsson in the top lane, Sheo in the jungle, Camelou in the mid lane, Flacket at AD carry, and Stend at support. Obviously, the good parts of this team are pretty clear, but I'm actually going to start in more of a negative way, because I do think a lot of the questions surrounding, my ranking of this team are going to be, why are the solo laners so low? Why is Karlsson so low? Why is Camelou so low? And honestly, I just wasn't that impressed with their tape individually. I think a lot of what they did well was created by the rest of this team, specifically by Sheo in the jungle, who I think had a pretty good winter split, all things considered, but I really need to see these two play better, more consistently. Karlsson had a couple of games where he looked okay on the top side. There was 1 or 2 where he was actually able to win, but man, the games he lost, he got absolutely obliterated in. It didn't feel particularly close, and honestly, I was not sold that he was ever going to be like more than a below average top laner by anything I saw in winter. It was super inconsistent. The mechanics are good, but they're really not great, and I think especially in the top lane role, your mechanics in the LEC need to be great in order for you to be able to compete with a lot of the upper tier, even middle tier guys who are really, really talented. And again, he just doesn't really seem to have a macro sense about him. He's a good team fighter. He's an okay laner, especially when he gets a good matchup. It's just not consistent. Like, there's nothing I've looked at that has shown me like, oh, this guy does one thing really well. At least GIANTX can lane at a decent level. Like, if he gets a winning matchup, he can kind of crush lane on things like Jace, and even if he runs it down in the back half of the game, at least there was a gold lead at some point in the top lane. Karlsson's gold leads feel entirely random and pretty unpredictable, which makes me concerned for them moving forward, because I'm just not sure, he's somebody that I'm super excited about. Now, that being said, he got better in the playoffs. He was one of the better performing members of the team once they got into best of 3s. If that ends up lasting, like if he is somebody that just gets better over the course of the year, then obviously I'm pretty excited for that, but at least from what we saw in the very limited sample size of winter, I was not particularly impressed, and I think you could say the same thing for Camelou. I think the only thing that I want to say when it comes to Camelou in terms of a positive, not that I'm trying to completely shit on him, is that he is very feast or famine. Like we talked about, we have no clue what we're going to get out of this guy coming into year number 1. He was the very clear choice to be the number 10 top laner, because he's basically coming out of tier 3 and jumping immediately into tier 1. It's just difficult to project a player like that to do well from day number 1, but Camelou had a couple of games, I'm talking 2 or 3, where he was able to get a lead in the early game, and he was able to take over. Now, basically any mid laner is capable of doing that. Anybody that isn't Larson is going to be able to take over the game in that way. Maybe Reeker, but Reeker can't generate leads. But when Kamalu did get leads, when he was able to kind of get funneled by Sheo, or when Stend was spending a lot of time in the middle of the map, he did a good job in the mid to late game of actually being able to capitalize on it. The problem is that when he loses lane, oh my god, does he lose lane. Like, he has no clue how to lose gracefully. There is just not a concept in there yet for that. That's something that typically you do develop at the tier 2 level. It's not shocking to not see that from a player who didn't really have to play against like ridiculously good talent at the tier 3 level, but it is something that's worth noting that while this guy can win you games sometimes, like I can look at 5 or 6 individual games from last split where he just like 1v9 lost the game for Team Heretics because he was down 50 CS and 4 kills in the mid lane and it was just over. Like, he was bleeding resources, and obviously there are flashes, there are good things to look at, but I think Winter was overall much more negative from a results perspective than people are going to give it credit for. Again, a lot of people are going to hype these two up because the expectations were so low, and quite frankly, there were moments, there were flashes for these two players, but it doesn't really change my opinion of them. They're talented, like they are in tier 1 for a reason. Clearly an LEC team was, willing to take a chance on them for a reason, but they are not finished products, and they're not players that I think elevate this team to being top 8. In fact, I think they hold them back from being higher than top 8 because the rest of this team is fine. I think the only other player that showed some question marks is the other rookie on this team, which is Stend, who was also decently inconsistent for them. There were some really good games, and I think for the most part, playing within structure was something that I was really excited to see from him. He was pretty good at playing within the routine of the rest of this team, not needing to be like a gigantic playmaker or not needing like a ton of resources or a ton of, extra protection in order to go out and make a lot of the plays that he wanted to make. He felt like a pretty stable support, but there were some games where he felt completely outclassed by the supports who were just a little bit better than him. That's always going to be a bit of an issue. He's coming in as number 8 for a reason. Like, he's not an upper tier support right now or anything like that, but I certainly don't think the floor is nearly as low as it is for Carlson, and especially for Kamalu, whose floor is just incredibly low right now. But you've got a pair of veterans on this team who lived up to the hype. Both Flackid and Sheo I thought were pretty good in the winter split. Sheo in particular really impressed me, and quite frankly, I didn't want to drop him. I wanted to keep him at number 4, and the player that's at number 4 right now, I wanted to keep at number 5, but I think I was just going to get too much pushback. I have to sometimes give over to public opinion if I think it would just be ridiculous for me to say anything else, but you want Sheo as a top 3, top 4 jungler in the LEC right now? I'm really not against that. I think Sheo's a really solid player. He's not a superstar. He's not the kind of player that's going to break through and dominate the game or anything like that, but he is a great team fighter, and he's really good at setting up his laners. He is just a very good complementary piece, a very good facilitator, and I think he's valuable for this team. He makes players like Kamalu's job a lot easier, Carlson's job a lot easier, and he gives them opportunities to be able to play from ahead, which is what they are good at. And then you guys know I'm a big fan of Flackid. Flackid was basically exactly who I thought he was in the winter split. He is a player that can win you games, that is going to do really well in the 2v2 in the bot lane because he's a very good 2v2 player. Solid enough skirmisher, okay team fighter. That's definitely the weakest part of his game, at least from my perspective, but, there are just a lot of good AD carries in the LEC right now, so he comes in at number 6. But Flackid, really solid AD carry, the best player on this team, somebody you can play through pretty regularly, and Sheo is a good facilitator, and that's why they're coming in at number 8, because when you talk about Rogue, when you talk about SK, they don't really have those kinds of players. They don't have the players that can elevate everybody else around them. The problem for Heretics is I just think their floor is really low because, like, if Carlson and Kamalu just have a bad game, which is super realistic, and if Stend isn't showing up and if Flackid can't carry, right, like, they just lose. They lose to basically anybody at a talent level from that point. So I'm just not sold that this team is going to be any better than number 8, but at least with their performance last split, I feel pretty confident they're not bottom 2. That being said, I would be shocked if they were top 6 going into playoffs or anything like that. I just don't really see this as a playoff team, and this is really the last team that I just could not see making the playoffs. Again, bottom 3 feels pretty locked to me in terms of my expectations. I hope that Carlson and Kamalu and Stend can take that next leap, that Sheo and Flackid can help that, but at least for now, I am still a bit concerned. Then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings, and this is really where I think you can start talking about playoff teams. I think it's really hard to narrow down the one team that I think will miss the playoffs, but honestly, this number 7 spot is going to this team purely because I just did not like the one off-season quote-unquote change that they made here going into spring. It's Team Vitality coming in at number 7 for me. I probably already would have put them at number 7, even with Hylissang here in support, but I think taking Hylissang out and putting Nisqy in made this decision a ton easier for me because I just don't really understand what the point of this is. Maybe it ends up working out, but I'll talk about why I just consider this to be bad practice in the first place, why I consider this to be like just a weird decision to make considering how things went in winter. But of course, their lineup is looking like Nako in the top lane, Linsas in the jungle, Chayak in the mid lane, Carzzy at AD carry, and Nisqy now at support. We'll start with the Nisqy conversation because I do think that that is kind of where the center of this Vitality team is going to be heading. Like the direction that this team is going to be moving in, I think is Nisqy, right? And not Hylissang. Nisqy is a much more controlled player. He can be pretty chaotic, at least he was in the mid lane. Obviously, we don't know how he's going to transition to support. I feel like he's going to be just fine in that role. He already was much more of a roamer than he was like an individual laner, although his laning was always a bit underrated. I think he's going to be good with Carzzy. Again, these two have a lot of experience playing together from their years on Mad Lions, and so you definitely have to imagine that this factored into the decision a little bit, that Carzzy was like, I'd rather play with Nisqy than Hylissang. But the problem for me with this process and with this decision is that I don't think Vitality has a playmaker now. Like, Nisqy is going to have to come in and be a primary option, and he's never played the position before. If he doesn't come in and create for the rest of this team, they don't have a playmaker. Chayak's a really good laner and honestly impressed me a lot in terms of his 1v1 ability and his ability to generate leads, but he is not like a roamer. He's not somebody who's going to be a gigantic playmaker for this team. Linsas, you can see I have as the number 10 jungler in the league. I just don't really believe in Linsas. I don't think anything on tape has really shown me that he is a particularly phenomenal player, and Nako is incredibly dangerous. He's super mechanically talented, but again, he's a top laner. Like, he's not going to be your primary creation option in the mid game. That's what Hylissang was for this team in winter, and like it or not, like those 4 losses, you could pretty much all attribute to Hylissang like running it down, being over eager and going like 0-8 or something like that. All 5 of their wins in the regular season, I think you can make a case to attribute to Hylissang. Like, I truly do believe that he was the player that was pushing this team forward. I talked about it a ton. I considered him for first team All-Pro in the winter split just because of how valuable he was to Team Vitality in terms of their wins, even though he was bad in their losses, and he definitely wasn't very good in the best of 3s. Like, all of those things can kind of tie together and be the same question, and maybe they just didn't want that feast or famine type of player, but I just don't really know where you're going to get that creative itch now. You're relying, again, so much on a player in Nisqy who has never played support at a professional level before in his entire career, and if he's not going to be able to come in and be what Hylissang was aggressive-wise, like, they are going to drop to number 7. They probably already were the 7th best team in the LEC last split, and I think it's definitely a little concerning. So we'll talk about Nisqy and what I think he can do well. You know, again, he's a smart player. I don't know what the champion pool looks like. I imagine he'll play Engagers well. He's always been somebody who's very willing to get involved in things. You know, who knows, right? Enchanters could be on the table for this team more so than other teams. That could definitely be interesting. I keep him at number 6 because Nisqy is a smart player, and I think he is mechanically talented enough to be able to make the 2v2 work. Maybe he's even a better 2v2 player than Hylissang. That was always kind of a bit of a weakness, and maybe that's why Carzzy was kind of pushing for Nisqy. Maybe they felt that they wanted to play for the lane a little bit more than Hylissang, just moving around the map and creating chaos. But the problem is just I have no idea what to expect from Nisqy. If he's going to be an average support, great. Hylissang was more important than an average support last split, and that to me is a downgrade if you are going from Hilly to Nisqy. So that's why this team comes in at number 7, but now we can start talking about the rest of the players on this team. You know, people are still going to be mad that I have Carzzy at 7. Like, that's still going to be a conversation down in the comments at some point. I feel like the people who watch this channel just have to understand that maybe we don't have the same opinions on Carzzy. He was exactly who we thought he would be. Actually, he wasn't exactly who we thought he would be. He was more of a controlled Carzzy, but at the end of the day, he wasn't really carrying games for this team in the way that he was in previous years. Like, the thing about Carzzy, and the reason I've always rated him so low, is because, you know, he is that feast or famine type of AD carry. Basically everything we just said about Camelou. Like, Carzzy obviously has a much higher ceiling, and the games he wins, it's much better from Carzzy. Like, there are times where he'll look like a top 1 or top 2 AD carry, but man, there are weeks where he'll look like a bottom 1 AD carry, and that just wasn't the case in winter. He was much more stable across the entire split, but that also kind of neutralized out his high end as well. At least for now, there are just too many good AD carries in the league for me to feel comfortable that Carzzy is, like, definitely worse than a lot of them, or definitely better than a lot of them. You know, for context, like, I'm not going to spoil too much, but he's coming in below players like Flacket, which I know people don't love, but I really like Flacket. He's coming in below, you know, I'm not going to go in order here just to keep a little bit of suspense, but players like Noah, players like Hansama, I just don't think you can justify that Carzzy was better than those players in the winter split, or project that he would be better than those players. And so For now, he stays at number 7. I think it's a pretty good place for him because AD carry is really strong. And the other like major positives for this team are the solo laners. I was really impressed with basically both of them in different ways. Both of them are very good laners, which I think is really important for Vitality. It definitely helped to establish kind of an identity for this team. GIANTX in particular, I thought was much more consistent as a player, but Knock, oh man, his highs are clear. Like the games he plays well in, he plays ridiculously well in, and he'll have one play every game that is like superstar material. The mechanical ceiling on Knock is super interesting and super fun to watch. Again, not a consistent player by any stretch of the imagination. As much as we talk about him having one play per game that looks incredible, specifically in the team fight stage, he'll have one play per game that looks awful, and you just kind of have to live with that. Again, if he can weed out some of those more egregious mistakes and just get more comfortable playing at this level, there is a chance that he emerges as a top 3, top 4 top laner right now in the LEC, like in the spring split. Hard to project him as that just because, again, it was a bit more flippy, a little bit more inconsistent from him, but man, the talent is very clear, and I think GIANTX, he's not like Knock in that sense. I think we kind of know what GIANTX is going to be, which is a pretty good laner who's going to be able to survive in the back half of the game. He's probably never going to be a superstar at this level, at least in the way that, like, you know, the top 5 mid laners all feel like they are a B+ or better. Like, GIANTX doesn't feel like he's in that conversation right now, but he is a solid starter in the LEC, and I think they're going to be happy that they found that. The only player that I'm actually really concerned about on this team is Linsauce, and it's not because I think Linsauce is like a horrible player with this like dynamically like low floor. We talked about players like Reeker and Loopy at number 10 who have ridiculously low floors, or Patrick, right, where it's just like their worst games are the worst in the entire league. Linsauce doesn't have that. Like, his bad games aren't the worst in the entire league. I just don't really see the upside anymore. The good games are not impressing me anymore, and I think that that's the thing that I'm really disappointed by. I really liked Linsauce when he was playing in the ERLs, when he was getting looks from North America and from Europe at the beginning of 2024. It really felt like he was going to be a player that came in and made an impact basically immediately, and I loved this pickup when they went and made it. I just don't think it's scaled or aged that well. I think that's the best way to put it. The ceiling doesn't really seem to be there for me. Maybe I'm proven wrong. Again, this team doesn't necessarily play around him in any conceivable way. This is much more of a solo lane or bot lane focused team. Like, Linsauce is definitely much more of a facilitator, but I think the thing that's the most concerning to me is that I would argue that Douglas was better than Linsauce when he was playing on this team last year, which is just not really acceptable because Douglas was already not a player that I was particularly high on. So we'll see what happens. Again, maybe Linsauce has a breakout now that he feels a lot more comfortable in the LEC. I just haven't seen it on tape. I like the solo laners. The bot lane could be really good and could even be better in the 2v2, but again, I'm just really worried that the primary form of creation and playmaking for this team is now gone, and that, you know, the identity, quite frankly, for this team might be gone, and that makes me put them at 7 because I just worry about their floor. This team could still be top 5. Like, they were, you know, borderline top 5 in the winter split in terms of the performance they had. We just need to see them actually be able to make the most of it, and I just have a harder time believing that now without Hylissang than I did when they had him. Then moving on to number 6 in my power rankings, and this is a team I just wish did a little bit better in the winter split. I still have some optimism for them, but at least I think they're a playoff team right now. It's Team BDS. I had so much optimism about this team going into the year. I thought their offseason was underratedly really good. I thought they did the best with what they had. Obviously, they would have loved to have been able to bring in both Paris and Skewmond and, you know, Irrelevant to be an upgrade in the top lane to keep Nuke and Ice as their core, but that just wasn't going to happen for BDS this offseason. It felt like everything was kind of destined to be a little bit harder for them than, you know, the other top teams in the league because other, you know, teams wanted their developmental talent that they were able to bring in as an org, but I still think there is reason to believe that this team has their best League of Legends ahead of them, and that's what I'm excited to talk about here, even if I do knock a lot of these players for being way worse than they should have been in the winter split, which you can kind of see in terms of their player rankings. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Irrelevant in the top lane, 113 in the jungle, Nuke in the mid lane, Ice at AD carry, and Paris at support. There were so many thoughts that I had about this team going into 2025. So much potential from a lot of these players. I was so high on Paris. I thought 113 was being under-discussed because it really felt like he kind of found his footing in 2024. Like, people were talking about previous years of 113's career when it really felt like they should be talking about the leaps and jumps that he made last year. But all of that kind of didn't come together in the winter split. Obviously, the young players, the promotions, didn't necessarily work out. But the thing I'm most disappointed about for BDS BDS is the veterans really not being particularly good. Irrelevant and Ice, I think, both played really poor in the winter split, really did not add a lot for this team. Irrelevant was one of the weaker top laners in the entire league, was pretty constantly losing in the 1v1, and just wasn't really able to survive. This is not something that longtime fans of the channel are going to be entirely surprised about. It's really funny because, again, I'll talk about this every time we bring up Irrelevant, but my arc with Irrelevant is, you know, very dynamic, where when he first came into the league on Misfits, I was really high on him. I thought he was a really good weak side top laner, somebody who was super consistent for a team that was trying to play around VTO and Neon and, you know, really trying to play towards that side of the map. He came in and was just really good in the 1v1s and was able to generate his own leads and, you know, be useful in team fights, and I was really in on him there. Really hyped up when he went over and signed with SK, and then the hype train kind of got out of control. People were talking about him as if he was the #1 top laner in the LEC. People were talking at the very least as if he was top 2, that he should be on a top tier team, and, you know, all of this stuff. And I was like, yeah, he's good, but he's actually turned a lot more feast or famine, right? He's traded in a lot of those, you know, more safe, more stable performances on the top side for a more aggressive, like, ceiling. And I think that that's a fair thing to do if you want to go in that direction. That was clearly an intentional choice made by Irrelevant to be a lot more feast or famine. When he won a lot harder. When he lost a lot harder. But he comes over to BDS and tries to employ that feast or famine style, and quite frankly, it's just a lot of famine. Like, the mechanics did not look like they were there for BDS. He was already a player that I felt worse about. I think his best split ever was his first split on Misfits, and I think he's been trying to capture that again, and at least for now, it just doesn't really seem like that's there. He's going to drop to be my #6 top laner in the LEC. He could get back into being top 2 or top 3. He was #3 going into the year, only behind Broken Blade and Adam, and obviously Adam is still pretty good. Broken Blade's still pretty good. Irrelevant's not on that tier anymore. He's just not in that conversation. He needs to be able to perform better to be able to get back to that. And you could say the same thing about Ice. He's got to be one of the biggest fallers of anybody in the entire league in terms of their individual positions. He's dropping from the #2 AD carry to the #8 AD carry. Now, part of that is just the fact that the middle cluster of ADCs in the LEC are just all really good. Right, we already talked about this. Players like Flackid, players like, you know, Noah, players like Karzi, you know, all of these players are about the same skill level as Ice. It's just that Ice was worse in winter, so he kind of loses the tiebreaker and ends up falling below them. But Ice was not good, and honestly, we could have kind of predicted this. What is Ice really good at as a player? Team fighting. Like, that is the thing he's really good at. He wants to pick Zeri, he wants to pick Jinx, he wants to pick these hyper carries, and he wants to be enabled to play the 5v5 in the back half of the game. That's what him and Labrov did really well. It's what him, Labrov, and Sheo in particular really did well at in 2024 to allow this team to succeed. But what is the meta right now? Well, it's certainly not hyper carries. It's certainly not stalling out the game. And quite frankly, Ice is not a good laner. And I honestly think I overestimated how good of a laner he could be and how much losing Labrov would actually hurt him in that regard, because he was genuinely maybe the weakest laner in the AD carry role in the entire league. Like, his 2v2 is just really, really bad. He still is a good team fighter, and he still can be successful at this level, but man, like, he is a very one-dimensional player, and I think that one dimension was just easily unlocked by the way that this team was constructed last year. I'm not sure you're going to get that same kind of performance out of him again, and I think part of that is Paris coming in over Labrov, who, you know, they don't have the same kind of synergy. Labrov is a late-game player. He's a team fight maestro. He's one of the best team fighters in the entire region, and Paris is just not that kind of player, and Paris certainly didn't play all that well at the start of this year, but I believe Paris can grow into being a really good player in that role. I think he is a good team fighter. He's a very smart player. He's a very vocal leader. It wasn't working out for him in winter. Again, he's going to come in at #7 for me. He's going to drop a spot. You know, he was not a star support, but I think things got better as the year went on. He was awful in week #1, and then it felt like things started to unlock. Most of the rookies were really bad at the start of the split, and you just kind of had to give them some grace there, but hopefully in spring we can start to see it unlock again. If this bot lane is not top 5 in the league, they're going to consider that a disappointment considering what the expectation was going into the year, and right now they are firmly not top 5. They are, like, arguably a bottom 3 bot lane in the league, which is really not good. 113 is a similar case as well. I think the hate on 113 went a little far last split. He, again, was kind of bad, very similar to Paris, kind of bad in the first week or so, and then got better as the split went along. I think we saw some really encouraging things for 113 by the end of the split. I think that there was a lot actually to like in terms of his tape. Certainly not a complete product, but again, I'm trying to give him some grace because his 2024 tape was really, really good, like a lot better than people are giving him credit for. People remember Astralis 113. That was not the player that they signed in 2024. The player that they signed mind was, you know, the K Corp 113 that was able to take over a lot of games in the LFL and was arguably just as valuable as Skewmond in a completely different role. Again, 113 much more of a carry player, and I don't think he's been playing that style on the team, but some more early aggression from him might actually unlock a lot of this team, because the one player we have yet to talk about in terms of this team so far is Nuke in the mid lane. And despite all of the hesitancy that I have surrounding this team, Irrelevant and Ice kind of taking steps back, 113 and Paris not being nearly as good as I thought they would be from day number one, the reason this is still clearly a playoff team in my eyes, or at least should be a playoff team in my eyes, is because they have one of the best players in the entire region right now in Nuke in the mid lane. I wish I had a tag or like a term that I could use for players like this, but the best way I've described it is kind of the delight role over in the LCK, where it's every single time I've watched this player, he just gets better and better and better, regardless of the circumstance and the situation surrounding him. Nuke was horrible at the start of his career. He was somebody who I was stunned to see get a second job after Schalke, and then especially after the first year on BDS, I just didn't think that he was going to be somebody that this team wanted to run back, but they did in 2023, and it worked. Nuke was actually really good for this team, and then in 2024, especially in summer, it was like, oh, there's some like hidden like primary carry potential for Nuke here, and then at the beginning of 2025, like he was legitimately like MVP caliber for BDS. He was actively carrying almost every single game for them. He was dominating his mid lane matchups, doing really well in the mid game. There's nothing else to see from Nuke at this point. He has shown me everything he needs to show me in order for me to say, yeah, you're one of the best, like, you're one of the 5 to 7 best players in the LEC, and I'm not even really all that scared to debate that. I have him at number 3. Spoiler alert for who that's above. Again, if you don't want to know the player rankings, then I guess why are you watching the video? But spoiler alert, that's above both Jojo Pune and Humanoid. I think he is a better and more valuable player than both of those two players right now in the LEC. Comes in as my number 3 mid laner, and I'm all in on Nuke. I think if he had a better surrounding core here, it would be even easier to spot just how good he has been, but he is the number 1 option on this team right now, and I think he can really live up to that. That's why I say if 113 ends up really being able to unlock that carry version of him, if you can slot Nuke into his more comfortable position of being a secondary carry for this team, he'd be the best secondary carry in the league, like full stop. 113 can get a lot of the resources. If Irrelevant can just win 1v1, that takes a lot of pressure off the bot lane. It takes a lot of pressure off of Ice to even be good at all in the 2v2, because a lot of that pressure and prio is going elsewhere early on in the game. I think it just opens up things a lot more if players like 113 end up, you know, playing well, because Nuke is so like good at a baseline and he's so good at basically every part of the game. And so for BDS, it's just really difficult for me to rank them below number 6, but quite frankly, it's difficult for me to rank them above number 6, because I do think the floor on this team is pretty low, because I really only have one player guaranteed to be good, even really at all, above average on this team, and that's Nuke in the mid lane. But Nuke is so above average that it does really elevate a lot of the rest of the rankings for this team. At the same time, like if Irrelevant, 113, Ice, and Paris don't step up, and if they are bad and below average players, this team is not going to be near where they need to be. If you can get 113 on track, if you can get Paris more comfortable, if you can get Irrelevant to start winning 1v1, if Ice just is able to get to the later part of the game and not feel as much responsibility to do things early, this can still be a top 4 team in the LEC. But right now, 6 feels like a pretty okay spot considering where they were at. But now moving on to number 5 in my power rankings, and I would consider this the top of like, you know, C+ tier, B- tier, whatever you want to call it. I think these are all, you know, playoff teams, but this is the team I probably feel the best about of the last 3, and that is GIANTX. And obviously there have been a lot of expectations surrounding this team for many years in multiple different iterations, whether they were Excel or now GIANTX, that they have pretty much always failed to live up to. But this team pretty clearly feels like the best of the rest at the current moment, at least in terms of my thoughts and opinions, and it all really comes down to one lane, because I don't think this is a very versatile team. I don't think this is a very complete team from top to bottom, but I do think that the good lane is really good, and the other players are probably good enough for you to be able to win with, so let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like Lot in the top lane, Isma now in the jungle, Jackie's in the mid lane, Noah at AD carry, and Jun at support. Of course, new jungle, not voluntarily from GIANTX. Closer ends up stepping away from pro play, or at least we are aware that he stepped away from pro play. We'll see, obviously, you know, what happens in the future if he ever comes back or anything like that, but at least for now, they had to, like, struggle to search to find another jungler. Luckily, Isma gets dropped by SK for basically no reason. Looked like he was going to go to K Corp, get swapped out for Bukata, but he ends up coming up here to the LEC. That opens up a spot for Yukino to come over here to Europe. You know, a lot of things end up happening this offseason, but Isma ends up being the replacement in the jungle. Quite frankly, this is a neutral change for me. These are not the same player. Like, they don't play the same way, but they kind of do. Like, Closer coming back to Europe, like when he was in North America, played very similarly to how Isma played in the first couple of splits that he was in the LEC. Both of them really kind of leveled out in terms of the way that they played their game, got a lot more versatile in terms of picking up tanks and things like that. But when Isma was kind of really coming through the ranks, what traits were really exciting to a lot of analysts for Isma was his aggressiveness in the early game. He just was a crazy ganker. This was a guy who was very willing to kind of throw the game away on a level 3 or a level 4, very Malrang style, very Closer style when he was in North America. Like, I think that that's a pretty fair comparison. Obviously, Closer ended up kind of neutralizing out. Isma also kind of neutralized out. I think his worst games came when he started being a little bit more passive. It felt like he was always going to be a bit more comfortable playing aggressive in the early game, and lucky for him, I think this team is actually in a pretty decent position to enable that and to kind of push forward that style. I'm really curious to see how Isma fits. I'm really not willing to call this a downgrade. I think the floor is lower with Isma than it was with Closer. I think Closer is like guaranteed to be a better player, but Isma's ceiling I think is a bit higher than Closer if you can get more out of him as a player. Certainly not trying to say that I think he'll ever be a top 3 or a top 4 jungler like right now, but could he be a top 5 jungler? Yeah, I think that that's a pretty reasonable thing to expect if things go right. I really don't understand SK letting him go, as we already talked about, but I think it is to GIANTX's benefit. And then, of course, the lane that you have to talk about in a positive way here is bot lane. I'm all in on Noah and Jun. I think these guys are absolutely ridiculous, and quite frankly, they were awesome. They were, like, truly excellent in the winter split. Things weren't quite as good, I would say, in the second half. They were still good, but they weren't elite in the same way that they were, like, week 1. They were, like, the best lane, the 2 best players in the entire league when this team went 3-0. It was actually absurd how well they were playing. We kind of talked this up. We kind of actually mentioned this in the off-season primer when we were talking about Noah and Jun coming over here. Noah has been very vocal about struggling with kind of the pressure that came along with playing for Fnatic, like one of the big orgs, and I was, kind of willing to say, hey, moving to kind of a smaller org here in GIANTX, a team that doesn't necessarily have the same expectations or, fan base, like, craziness kind of going on around it, maybe Noah's going to be able to just kind of unlock his gameplay a bit more, kind of being away from a lot of the noise, and I think that absolutely happened. Noah is a very good AD carry at this level. He does a little bit of everything. He can be really good in the 2v2, especially if you get him ahead early. Like, if Isma wants to spend a lot of time and attention playing for bot lane, which I think is super fair for this team, getting Noah a lead is really dangerous for the enemy team because he is really good at pressuring advantages. He's an okay 2v2 player, but he is a really good hyper carry player as well if you want to play him, on something like, Aphelios, which he kind of was known for at the beginning of his career, but Jinx, Zeri, that kind of stuff. He's really good in that role as well. Not to say he can't play Ezreal or Ashe or whatever at a high level. He's just a very good AD carry for this level and somebody that I think a top team would really love to have. Like Fnatic would, I wouldn't say Fnatic would love to have him because Upset's been really excellent for the team and has been an upgrade there, but Noah is a really good AD carry. Certainly not someone to overlook, and Jun, I think, is awesome as a support. I'm all in on Jun, which is so funny considering the turnaround. I was so anti-Jun in the LCK, and when he came over and when Fnatic signed him, I thought it was really bad practice to be importing a player who just kind of failed in the LCK that didn't really have a lot of success, but boy, was I wrong. Clearly, they saw something in Jun that was very unlockable. I think he's the second best support in the LEC right now. I think he's really, really good, and he's a big playmaker. Like, that's the thing about Jun is he's not just, like, good at the little things where, sometimes with a player like Lebrov, right, when we hyped him up the past couple of years, it's like, yeah, he might not be the flashiest player in the league, but you have to watch all the little things that Lebrov does. He's a big shot caller, he's a great team fighter, his mid games are really good, he's not the best, like, 2v2 laner, but, like, you have to, like, dig deep in order to kind of notice things. Jun is a playmaker. He still does the little things very well, but he is very good at the big things in that same vein, and it just makes me confused why people aren't hyping up this bot lane more. I think they're very clearly, like, at worst a top 3 or a top 4 bot lane in Europe right now. They really are that dynamic and that good, and they're the reason that GIANTX is here in the top 5, because the rest of this team does have question marks. I think Isma might come in and integrate well, but quite frankly, Jackie's was just not good enough in the winter split. He was the worst player on this team in winter. I don't even think that's really all that up for debate. He was not good at all, and I hate to say it, like, I didn't see this coming. I thought he was going to break out, but, like, we are certainly not surprised on this channel. I actually had a pretty big narrative last year, at the end of last year, when I didn't name him Rookie of the Year, that I think we forgot how bad he was in spring. Like, I think we just, like, all collectively got rid of that from our brains. We were all just like, it doesn't really matter that Jackie's was bad in spring because he came on in summer and, Rookie of the Year and all that stuff. I thought Supa and Alvaro definitely deserved Rookie of the Year over Jackie's because Rookie of the Year talks about the year, and he was up and down in winter. He had some good moments and some bad moments. He was awful in spring, and then he was really good in summer, and that to me is not Rookie of the Year. Unfortunately, we saw a lot more of like spring Jackies than we saw summer Jackies in winter of this year, which is just not a good place for him to be. I still think there is upside here, but if he continues to play the way that he did here, like he could fall below 6. He was not better than someone like GIANTX on Vitality. He was just not over the course of winter. He's going to have to be better. And kind of a similar thing for Lot. Obviously, the situation's a bit different. He's a rookie coming in, and he did have some good games, especially when this team was doing well at the beginning of the split. When they started off really hot, like Lot was really, really in good form for that, and I think he really benefited a lot from the rest of the team having a ton of prio. His team fighting in particular was really excellent, but he was very good as a weak side top laner, was really impressed with him in that regard. As this team started to level out a bit more, as, you know, the results started to become a bit more expected, they got closer to 500. I think a lot started getting outplayed in the 1v1 a lot more, and that was definitely something worth noting. Again, if he can be closer to the version that he was in week 1 and like at the start of week 2 than he was in like the playoffs and the best of 3s for this team, then I think that's going to be good. But Lot's not a bad player. He's just not a particularly high floor player, at least in my opinion at this point. But if the solo laners are okay, especially if Jackie's is actually going to be good for this team in the mid lane, like if he can show up and show that version of him in summer and Isma can integrate well, Noah and Jun can be like a primary carry lane down in the bot lane that is like strong side for this team, and Lot can be the weak side top laner, that's a really well constructed team. But there are some bounce back candidates needed for that, and that's why it's just really hard to put them in the top 4, where it feels like the top 4 were so clear in the winter split. Right now, GX is the team that I think has the most upside outside of that top 4, but if this team finished 7th, like, am I gonna be shocked? No, like, there is a world where Isma, Jackies, and Lot are just not good, and Noah and Jun do take a bit of a step back. Instead of being like a top 3 bot lane in the LEC, they're only like a top 5 or so bot lane in the LEC. Like, that's a pretty realistic outcome, and that team could be 7th or 8th in the LEC, so there's still a lot that can go wrong. There's a reason they're in the same tier as BDS and Vitality for me, but at least for now, I have them at the top of that tier because I do think that their best players are players that I trust a little bit more. But then moving on now to number 4 in my power rankings, and this is where we start to get to the teams that I think are pretty obvious. Obviously, top 4 was pretty clear in winter, and I have no disagreements with that. I don't think it will change going into spring, but also number 4 was pretty clear for me. It is going to be Movistar KOI. It really did feel quite obvious, quite frankly, that the top 3 were all going to be competing to try and make first stand and to try to win the LEC, and then KOI was very clearly better than everybody below them and kind of worse than everybody above them, and I think that's still where I project them to be going into this split. I think that there is a ton of upside potential for this team because I do think the mechanical talent on KOI is ridiculous, but the problem is their consistency is just incredibly low, and that's just what happens when you bring in a bunch of players who are kind of feast or famine in the way that these players are. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Mirwin in the top lane, Elyoya in the jungle, Jojo Pume in the mid lane, Supa at AD carry, and Alvaro at support. There are some really good ratings on this team, and you can really see the jump, I would say, from number 5 to number 4 in terms of the player ratings, because the lowest that we have on this team is 5th. Like, we have an average player in these roles, or theoretically, like, league average player in these roles, and that's, like, your weakest player, and most players on this team are elite, and even the players that are quote-unquote league average have elite upside and elite mechanics. It can take over basically any situation. The problem is, again, that the consistency on this team just is not particularly high. Even the players that I have rated pretty high, I don't feel all that great about right now. Really, the exception to that is the bot lane. I still feel really good about Supa and Alvaro. I still feel like they're a top 3-ish bot lane in the LEC. Of course, there are a lot of bot lanes that I think are going to be competing to be top 3-ish, but Supa and Alvaro to me feel like one of the ones that is kind of a lock for that. I just would be surprised if they ended up dropping below that. They are the consistency of this team. Supa might not be the most consistent player in the universe, but for the most part, he just doesn't really have awful games. He's going to have games every once in a while where he's not quite as effective, but he can still dominate a lot of really good players at this level. Supa is an elite AD carry, somebody who should be considered in the upper echelon of that position, and Alvaro obviously helps him out a lot in that regard. Both of these guys are pretty elite in terms of what they do on the Rift for their team. And I honestly wish I had more to say about them, but honestly, they're exactly who we thought they would be going into the year. They are exactly who we said they were last year, and who they have been for their entire tenure in the LEC, which is one of the upper tier bot lanes, maybe not one that is going to consistently be number 1, or, you know, they're not players that I'm expecting to be first team all-pro or anything like that, although I think it's definitely possible for both of them. They're just a really solid, really good bot lane that I think helps this team out a lot, and like I said, they are the consistent piece of this team. They're the reason that the floor is so high for Movistar KOI. KOI, because when you talk about a team like GIANTX that's right below them, their bot lane's really good, but it's worse than KOI's, and KOI has other pieces around them. The other pieces on this team, though, inconsistent, and they were inconsistent last year too, which is the frustrating part. It felt like they were trying to upgrade a ton in the mid lane, and it just didn't necessarily land yet. Now, it is still an upgrade in my opinion. JoJo is still going to be the number 5 mid laner in the league, but this is a downgrade from what we thought we were going to get out of JoJo Pune. Quite frankly, it was more bad than good, I will say, in the winter split, and I know some people might disagree with that opinion, but I wasn't in love with JoJo Pune's tape. I think every single time that KOI struggled, it was because of JoJo Pune not doing particularly well in the mid lane, and I get that he's not a particularly consistent player. I get that he's a high resource player, and Elyoya is also kind of a high resource jungler, and there can be times where that just clashes and you know, is counterintuitive towards itself, but JoJo had to be better in the 1v1s than he was, and he was just okay. He certainly wasn't good enough against the actual good competition in the league, which is what you brought him in to be. You brought him in to be an upgrade to Fresskowy, not only because he has a higher mechanical ceiling, but because you need to try and win the league. You want a mid laner that can help you get above teams like Fnatic and K Corp and G2, and JoJo just wasn't in a position to do that for this team in winter. Any given game, he can pop off, be the best player in the league, but it's really hard to say that he's better than Nuke or that he's better than Humanoid, because he really wasn't in the winter split. He had games where he was definitely better than those players, but the consistency is just not there, so he's gonna fall to number 5. Again, top 5 is all so good. Jackie's comes in at number 6. Like, there are so many good mid laners in the LEC. It's really difficult to project one of these players, you know, to be like excellent no matter what. But the problem for JoJo is that this is a long running trend. This is the reason he's in Europe in the first place, is because a lot of North American teams just couldn't deal with a lot of his consistency. But you could say the same thing for the top side of the map here. Elyoya, certainly not a particularly consistent jungler. This ranking is hanging on by a thread. There are multiple junglers that are, you know, trying to break through. I think jungle's a pretty weak position in the LEC, at least at the top level right now. There are 2 junglers that I feel good about being, like, elite level, and then there's a lot of the rest of the pack, and Elyoya at least has the track record to be at the top of that, but he does not synergize well with JoJo Pune. These two do not look like they play well off of each other, and this is the second year in a row where it felt like Elyoya wasn't necessarily playing up to his own individual standards. Now, last year he was awesome in winter and in spring, and it was really just the summer split where things started to go worse for Elyoya, but that summer has carried over into 2025, at least so far. Again, I want to give him some grace. I want to give him some time because he still was pretty good in jungles, not a deep position at this level, but that number 3 spot is definitely generous considering how he has been the last 2 splits that he's played. And then there's Mirwin on the top side, who's actually going to be moving up in my rankings. I was more impressed by Mirwin in winter of this year than I was at any point in 2024, and that includes a lot of the breakout games. Like, we knew that he could win on these weird off-meta, you know, super creative picks. We knew that if he surprised his opponent, he could do a lot of things. We saw him beat G2 in a best of 5 with that strategy in, you know, at the end of the year in the season finals of last year. But what really impressed me about winter, it was his success that he had on Cassante, on Ambessa, on these more meta champions, because that's really what's going to unlock Mirwin to be a top laner in the LEC. If he wants to be on that same level as a lot of the upper tier guys, not only does he need the off meta picks, but he needs to be able to play the meta picks at a really high level, and he did show a lot of ability to do that. I'm much higher on Mirwin right now than I was going into the year, which is a good thing. Top lane's just really good at the LEC level, or at least good at the top end of the LEC level, and Mirwin's sample size is smaller than a lot of the players that he's ranked below. He comes in right above somebody like Irrelevant, and honestly, Irrelevant was considered like a top 1 or a top 2 top laner last year, so, you know, I don't want it to seem like I'm trying to downplay Mirwin. I just think top lane's a pretty good role, but he himself is also still inherently inconsistent, right? It's one split of him being a consistently good top laner. He wasn't that in 2024. He was an inconsistently good top laner in 2024. So I still need to see more out of Mirwin. I need to see that this version of him in winter is sustainable, and there's a lot of things that kind of need to go right for KOI. Yes, they have the upside to dominate. Their mechanical skill is ridiculous. If Mirwin, JoJo, and Supa all pop off in one game, I think they can beat anybody in the LEC. I think that version of the team where Mirwin, JoJo, and Supa are all winning, that's the best team in the LEC. The problem is we've not seen that, and I really don't expect to see that throughout this year. I think there will always be somebody on this team that's just not playing up to their own individual standards, which is why they come in at number 4. Their floor is too high to be anywhere below this, but it does feel like they are at least a half a tier below the top 3 teams who are going to compete to win the league. But now we get to move on to number 3 in my power rankings, the top 3. And again, third place was pretty easy for me. Despite their good regular season, they just couldn't get the job done in the playoffs. And I worry that that's going to be somewhat regular for them. It's Fnatic coming in at number 3 for me. Again, this was the number 1 seed coming out of the regular season. It felt like they were finally starting to put things together. But I think when you look at the construction of this roster, there are just inherent inconsistencies that are going to be difficult to overcome for this team to win the entire league. Again, I think they're going to continue to be relevant. In fact, I could see them being a number 1 seed again. I just have a hard time believing that in back-to-back-to-back best of 5s, they're going to consistently be able to play like the best team in the league, which is why they come in a little bit lower than the top 2. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Oscarinin in the top lane, Razork in the jungle, Humanoid in the mid lane, Upset at AD carry, and Mickey X at support. Of course, this lineup is still very, very good. We're starting to just really get to the part of the league where it's like there's no weaknesses. This team has no weaknesses. It's really difficult to pinpoint and highlight one player as being an issue or a problem for this team. There are a couple of players here whose rankings might be a little bit controversial. I'm curious to see how people end up reacting to it. Let's start with the good, and then we can kind of get to the ones that I think people are going to be a bit more upset about, like Oscarinin on the top side. But let's start with the bot lane, the best bot lane in the LEC. I feel pretty confident in saying that Upset and Mickey X are about as good as you could possibly have asked for from Fnatic. Mickey was already like near the top of my list for, players that I expected to do really well this year, not because he was leaving G2, but because it's an odd year, and Mickey X is always much better in odd years than he is in even years. It's very strange how that ends up happening. Good year, bad year is a very real thing for him, but this is the odd year, so this is the year that he is going to do really well, and he was incredibly good for Fnatic, an MVP frontrunner for a lot of people in the regular season, a big reason why this team was so successful, and I don't think their playoff woes or their playoff losses were entirely due to Mickey or anything like that. I think that there are multiple players on this team that I'll point out later that had really bad playoff runs, but, Mickey had a couple of bad games here or there. You're just going to live with that, like he is that kind of support, but at the end of the day, he is the most valuable support right now in the LEC, and I think he went and proved that. And then Upset. Talk about, like, the biggest riser of this entire process. He's going up 7 spots. He's my number 180 carry right now. There's just no way to look at it any other way, in my opinion. I think he performed like the best 80 carry in the region. I think it's kind of up to you whether you want to put him or Kaliste at number 1. Spoiler alert, they are 1 and 2 in terms of these rankings, but Upset, I think right now feels like the guy that I have at number 1. These rankings are so volatile that they can basically go in any direction. The people that I had at number 1 or number 2 or number 3 at the beginning of the year, they're nowhere near number 1 or 2 or 3. Number 1 at the beginning of the year doesn't have a job right now for me, and regardless of whether or not you agreed with that take or not, it just goes to show how close a lot of this AD carry field is, because a lot of teams really just like to play for ADCs. All of these players are really good, and it's really just about the scenario and the situation that can get the most out of these AD carries. I think Upset is in a position where he gets the most out of himself on Fnatic, and I think they are the best bot lane right now in the LEC, which is why I have them both ranked at number 1. If you wanted to put other players above them, I could theoretically consider that. Again, especially Upset, I could consider putting him at number 2, but I just think, like, number 2 is probably about as low as I could possibly go in terms of expectation for him moving forward, because he really was that good in the winter split. Also, the other positive, and it's not going to show it here in terms of these player rankings, is Oscarinin on the top side. I think he's pretty clearly, like, at times the 3rd best player on this team. There is definitely going to be a vocal part of the fan base in the comments of this video that is pissed off at me for not putting Oscarinin in top 3, that feels it's ridiculous that he's below a player like Adam. I don't know what to tell you at this point. Like, you should know what to expect when it comes to my videos, quite frankly, if you've been a longtime viewer of the channel. If you are not a longtime viewer of the channel, I just don't really value Oscarinin's high points as highly as I value Adam's high points. I think Adam's best games are better than Oscarinin's best games, and I think they both still have bad games, but Oscar was super consistent over the course of the winter split, and quite frankly, they have basically identical grades. If you wanted Oscar at number 3, put Oscar at number 3. I just think Adam was better than Oscar last year, and both of them performed about as I expected this year. Oscar was a little bit better, but I do think he's the 3rd best player on this team right now. Razork and Humanoid, we'll get to them in a second. Razork was awesome in the regular season, but, Oscar is solid enough as a top laner. It's just a really good top lane class right now in the LEC. Again, if you wanted him at number 3, I think that's about as high as I'm probably willing to go with him right now, but there's been so much discourse about, oh, what does Oscar need to do to be top 3? Where does he need to, you know, how much more can he possibly do to be top 3? If you want him top 3, he can be top 3. What he needs to do more of to be top 3 is either completely pop off, like be a guy that's actively, you know, playing strong side and winning games for his team in the way that, you know, Adam was or Kana was throughout a lot of this split, or be like the best weak side top laner in the league. He's not either of those things. Those are the two things that need to be done in order for you to be like an A caliber player. He's just not that guy. He's a B plus. He's a very good top laner, and you're very happy to have him. And again, if that's top 3 for you, that's totally fine. It's just not for me at the current moment. And then we got to get to the conversation on the mid-jungle duo here. Razork was the single best player in the LEC for my money in the regular season. It wasn't even particularly close. When you're talking about Fnatic dominating games, it's because Razork continued his awesome trend from 2024 of just being able to completely obliterate the early game every single time they played. He would always be going into the mid game with a pretty gigantic gold lead, and that's like unovercomable for a lot of the teams in the league. It's really difficult for you to be able to take advantage of that. The problem for Razork is he was this team's worst player in the playoffs, and I don't even think it's remotely close. He was completely outclassed and outplayed by almost every jungler that they went up against in the playoffs, especially in the best of 5 stage. He was not nearly as good as Yike on the other side of that. That's why he drops to number 2, but quite frankly, he needed to be better against a player like Skewmond in the best of 3, and he just wasn't. It really needed to be more from Razork, and once again, it's him not coming up in the clutch. That's been something that's been pretty regular for him throughout his career, and Humanoid's kind of the same way, although it's kind of the opposite. Like, Humanoid will just always have stretches where he's not particularly good. It's basically a dice roll at the beginning of a split, whether or not you're going to get the good or the bad version of him. He was fine, pretty inconsequential, quite frankly, to Fnatic's success overall over the course of that split. I think that there is a world in which he's better, but it's really hard for me to say right now that he's better than a player like Nuke, who was way more valuable to BDS than Humanoid was to Fnatic, especially because I think Nuke is way more consistent than someone like Humanoid is. But at the same time, could he be a top 2, top 1 mid laner at any given point? Yeah, he could. The top 5 mid laners are all ridiculously good. He comes in above a guy like Jojo Pune, who has a ridiculous mechanical ceiling. I'm not trying to shit on Humanoid. I'm just trying to say that mid lane is very good at the top level here in the LEC. And if this team is going to be held back, it's because the inconsistencies of this mid-jungle duo continue to permeate this organization. They've kept these two for years. This is the core of the team. And quite frankly, as far as I'm aware, and I've said this for many, many years at this point, this core of Razork and Humanoid is the reason they're not able to get over the hump. That is the reason that they are consistently the second or the third best team, because these two are just not consistent enough to be able to make it happen. I hope they prove me wrong. I really do, but everything is there now. They have the best bot lane in the league. Oscar Rinnan has really come into his own on the top side. So much responsibility is now on these guys that this organization has planted their flag on year after year. And they either get it done or they don't. Like, this is the year. If they don't win a title this year, I cannot imagine how you run it back again for 2026, regardless of how good you think these two players are. So, a lot of potential on Razork and Humanoid, but at least for me, I have them at number 3 because of that. I just can't possibly put them higher. The inconsistency is a little bit too much for me, but who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is finally the split, finally the year for Fnatic to overcome their demons. I just think it will be yet another year of finishing near the top of the standings, but not quite good enough for first. But then coming in at number 2 in my power rankings, it's a team that all offseason really, or all between winter and spring, I really thought was going to be at number 1 in these power rankings, and I sat down to think about it and I said, you know what? I really don't feel all that good about this team. It's G2 coming in at 2 in my power rankings. This might be the first time ever in this channel's history that G2 mid-year has come in number 2. I think ever since I put Excel at number 1 in 2023, I've never gone back and been like, yeah, G2's actually the second best team in the league. I think they've been at number 1 ever since then, regardless of what's happened throughout the splits, regardless of, you know, them losing any sort of anything. And it's kind of a bittersweet feeling to have them at number 2 in these power rankings, because it's so hard to bet against G2, because to me, they still have the best player in the league, even if that is much more contentious now than it was, you know, a couple of months ago or at all last year. And also, you know, they still have like a really good top side. Like, the players on this team are really good. But at the end of the day, I just think that this is the weakest version of G2 that we've seen in quite a long time. I think they're certainly the most beatable version of G2 that we've seen in a long time, and I think there's multiple reasons for that. So let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like Broken Blade in the top lane, Skewmond in the jungle, Caps in the mid lane, Hansama at AD carry, and Labrov at support. I want to start with Skewmond, and that feels like a very weird place to start with G2, but I think it's important to get my thoughts on Skewmond out there. I am not on the Skewmond hype train. I really am not. I did not see it in the winter split. There are so many people out there that are like, he was rookie of the split. It wasn't close. He was rookie of the split. First off, what is going on? Like, who are you people? I don't really understand how you can really make that assertion at all, especially so confidently when Kaliste was a rookie. Like, I just don't understand how you can look at the tape and say that Skewmond was better than Kaliste. I get that a lot of people really want to be excited about the back half of that playoff run, and trust me, he's being graded on a curve here, because not only does he play for G2, but he was a super hyped prospect, and he was good in the back half of their playoff run. That first series against KOI Corp was incredibly good from Skewmond, and I think that's really the big encouraging sign, is that he outplayed Razork in their series against Fnatic, their best of 3, and then he outplayed Yike the first time they played against each other, but the second time, he got completely outplayed, and quite frankly, his regular season was below average. Like, he was not an average jungler in the regular season. I said this at the end of week number 2, and, you know, going into week number 3, I was like, Skewmond is a lot closer to being 1-1-3 right now than he is to being, you know, Razork or Yike, and that, I just don't think is a popular opinion, and again, he's kind of being graded on a curve here, because I do think he's gonna get better throughout the year, but this is not an elite jungler. Like, I'm sorry, he's just not an elite jungler right now. Maybe he grows into that by the end of the year, but if you're just telling me to watch the winter tape, I cannot get behind calling him like a top 3 jungler in the league. I just can't do that. He's not as good. He's certainly not near the top 2. Like, Razork's regular season, regardless of what happened in the playoffs, immediately puts him above that, and Yike is just a better player than Skewmond in basically every single way. Like, shout out G2, but, like, if you wanted Skewmond at 3, I guess you could make the argument, but he wasn't better than someone like Sheo in winter, in my opinion. He just had way more opportunities. He had way more resources, and so it's difficult for me, because I really am not in love with the tape, but you have to start projecting, and you have to assume that he's going to get better on a team that is really good around him, and, you know, there are a lot of smart people in the industry that really like him. I just haven't seen it yet. Maybe it's there. I don't know. I'm a little bit concerned about Skewmond, and quite frankly, I'm very concerned about the bot lane. You can see that in the rankings. This is not an above-average bot lane. Like, they're not an above-average bot lane. Hansama is an average AD carry right now in terms of the production that he is giving you. You could perhaps convince me that Hansama is better than this. I think Labrav is better than this, but the big reason why both of them get dragged down so much to the number 5 ranking, first off, is that AD carry is a very stacked role near the top, and so is support, quite frankly. Like, it's very difficult to break into the top 4 in terms of supports right now, because I really do value players like Jun very highly, and so both of them end up kind of right outside that upper tier at number 5, but also their skill sets are so anti-synergistic that it is actually a major issue, and that was the problem we saw. Labrav was not getting out on the map and creating a lot for the team, because he's really not that aggressive of a player in the mid game. That's not really his style. He'd much rather play for 2v2s in lane and to help his AD carry get into the late stage of the game, and I'm sorry, that's just not who Hansama is. He is a skirmisher, he is a fighter, he is somebody who wants to be able to take over in the mid game, and these two are not clicking. Like, both of them played worse than they needed to. Labrav was obviously more noticeably bad, I would say, than Hansama was, but Hans, I think, was under the radar kind of bad, or at least kind of average, like, throughout the entirety of this previous split, and if they don't fix that, like, I'm sorry, that's what's keeping G2 out of being the number 1 team in the league. I'm not all in on Skewmond. I think that he is, like, a tier away from being in the upper tier conversation in terms of junglers in the league. I think there is still development that needs to happen that I need to see in the LEC, and I just don't think this is a top 3 or 4 bot lane right now. I think this is a league average bot lane, quite frankly, and both of them are playing worse than their actual skill level because of their anti-synergy together, and that's what's keeping G2 out of the top number 1 for me, even if they still have solo laners that I fully believe in. Caps still is my highest graded player in the LEC. Some people might be upset about that because he was really bad in the finals. He had his worst finals ever, at least in my opinion, got completely outplayed by Vladi and just didn't really feel like he was in that series at all. I don't think Caps is going to do that for the rest of the year. I'm sorry, I just don't believe that that's the real version of Caps. I think the real version of Caps is going to come out and dominate the spring split, and honestly, if he wins MVP across this year because he just obliterates the second half of the year, I'm not going to be all that surprised. That's who Caps is, and now he kind of has a fire under him. Like, he hasn't lost in forever. The fact that he's finally on the back foot for the first time since 2023 spring, and even then, like, he won winter and summer that split. Like, this is really the first time he's been on the back foot in years, like, since 2022. Like, I really believe that he's going to show up and dominate. That's why he's still number 1 for me. I'm projecting him to be the best player in the league. And then Broken Blade does drop down to number 2, but not because I think Broken Blade himself is bad. I think he was a bit underwhelming in the regular season. I wanted to see a bit more pressure go his way, but I understand them wanting to integrate Skewmond and Labrav a little bit more and play towards them. That's why they were struggling a bit at the start of the split, but Broken Blade, when it really mattered the most at the end of the playoffs, did start to step up. He was good in that series against KOI Corp, specifically the first one, the winners finals one, and not the grand finals one, but it's just hard hard for me to say he's the best top laner in the LEC with how well Kana played throughout the entirety of the split. And so right now he comes in at number 2, but they have basically identical grades for me at the current moment. If one of them, eclipses the other pretty handily over the course of this split, the only thing I'll be surprised by is that the other wasn't able to keep up. Like, there is a clear top 2 and then a little bit of everybody else, but Broken Blade is still in that upper echelon, and these solo laners are still absolutely elite. It's just really hard for me to project that this team is going to get top 1 when I don't really believe in the bot lane, and I am lower than consensus on jungle. Like, that is a hard barrier for me to cross, even if I do think Caps is better than people are going to give him credit for right now, and I think Broken Blade is totally fine. It's just hard for me to say that G2 as a whole is in that position. So for now, I'm going to trust the results of Winter. I'm going to probably eat my words when this team just completely runs away with the rest of the year, when the bot lane starts to figure things out, when Skewmon becomes a top 1 jungler, just like Yike became for G2. When all of that happens, I'm going to look like an absolute idiot. But I have to trust my eyes for now, and my eyes tell me that this team is number 2 in the power rankings. But that's going to bring us to number 1 in my power rankings, and the team that's left, process of elimination, you can probably guess that it's the defending champion, Karmine Corp. They are number 1 for me. K-Corp comes in as the team that I'm expecting to be number 1 again going into spring for now, and I think a lot of that is just the consistency of this roster. I think obviously them going to the finals of First Stand helps out a little bit, but honestly, I'm not super enthused by that international performance. They got super lucky to be in that position in the first place. They made it count by beating CFO at the end of the day. Like, they were able to take a series off of Top Esports. They took a game off of Hanwha Life, like in both of the series that they played. Like, there were positives to take away from K-Corp's international performance, but quite frankly, I'm walking out of First Stand just kind of talking about everybody that wasn't HLE as not good enough, because everybody that wasn't HLE just wasn't good enough. CFO is really the only other team that I feel good about coming out of that tournament, and they lost to K-Corp, and so there definitely is, still some negative feelings for me about this team in that way, but domestically, how do you not rank this team near the top? Look at these numbers. They're so consistent across the board. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Kana in the top lane, Yike in the jungle, Vladi in the mid lane, Kalista at AD carry, and Targamas at support. Where do I start here? Quite frankly, this can be the team that we go from top to support in. That's a pretty easy way to go about it, because basically everybody on this team is a positive for them right now. Starting with Kana in the top lane, there is no debate for me. Kana should be considered the number 1 top laner in the league coming into this split. I love Broken Blade, and his track record is ridiculous, but Kana was unreal kinds of good. In Winter, it feels like he's adjusted really well to playing with European talent at this point, and he's adjusted well to being in Europe. Like, the beginning of last year, just generally last year when he was brought in midway through the year to try and salvage K-Corp season, it was okay. Like, he was fine. He wasn't elite. He just was good, and I think we were looking for maybe a bit more out of Kana, and then 2025 hit like a truck. Like, he came out and started dominating games basically from day 1, and quite frankly, at First Stand, he was this team's best player. I don't even think that that's even remotely debatable. This guy was awesome internationally, and I expect that to continue. Right now, he's playing like prime Kana, like T1 Kana, and I think that version of him on K-Corp is very difficult to deal with for most of the top laners in this league, and this is a good league for top lane, and Kana to me still stands above all of the rest. He's a great laner, he's a great team fighter, he just does everything at a really high level. And then Yike is also going to come in as my number 1 jungler, and I don't know if this is going to be controversial, but with Razork really struggling in the playoffs, this was a pretty easy decision. Yike and Razork are 1A, 1B, or at least the top 2 in terms of junglers in the league right now. I think that that's pretty clear in my eyes. Maybe Skewmon ends up joining that list one day if he can continue to grow, but how do you not look at Yike's playoff run and say that he's the best jungler in the league? He was not only awesome in the regular season, because he was exceptionally good in the regular season, but he was really, really important in the playoffs for this team as well. To me, it's very obvious. He is the number 1 jungler. He's been the number 1 jungler for a little while now. I was worried that going to K-Corp would kind of lessen his ability to dominate and carry games. That has been the furthest from the truth. He was able to dominate domestically. Now, there were really bad performances at First Stand, especially at the start of the tournament. He turned things around at the end of that tournament, and I think that was encouraging. He is very flexible as a player. I imagine, at least domestically, he's going to continue to dominate. And you could say the same thing for Vladi. Now, Vladi, I think, was even worse than Yike at the tournament because he did not turn things around, in my opinion, at First Stand. They gave him player of the series against CFO. I talked about that. That is absurd. He was not good internationally, and I think, obviously, there are some growing pains there, but I just can't put him below number 2 in terms of the mid laners right now. Like, he is clearly more consistent and has a higher ceiling than players like Nuke, Humanoid, and JoJo that would be fighting it out for that number 2 spot, and I'm really happy to be able to say that. We were talking about him as like, oh, you know, him and Jackie's are looking good as breakout candidates. I had him at number 6 in terms of the mid lane rankings heading into the year. He has far exceeded those expectations. He's hyper consistent, at least domestically. His bad games really aren't all that bad. That's a little bit shaken by how bad he was at first stand, but, you know, domestically speaking, he really hasn't had bad games, and the upside is definitely still there. He completely mega gapped Caps in the finals to be able to win this team a championship, and so I feel great about Vladi. The only reason he doesn't come in at number 1 is because I think Caps is, you know, kind of in for a ridiculous year, as I talked about in the G2 segment. I think, you know, there's going to be a fire lit under him, and I think Vladi might struggle to be able to keep up with that version of Caps, but maybe he can. Who knows? If he does it again, yeah, he's going to be number 1 in these rankings. And I think you could say the same thing for Kalist, who, I mean, yeah, sorry, I was wrong. Like, I was, you know, talking about him at the beginning of the split, and I was like, he is such a good prospect. He has so many good mechanics and so many good tools. I don't think it's going to happen year 1. I don't think he's going to be like a top 1 or a top 2 AD carry year 1. I think the position is simply too good. I think it's hard to break through the top upper echelon. Boy, was I wrong. He was everything you could have asked for and then some. The fact that there's any conversation about who rookie of the split was blows my mind, because Kalist was by far the best rookie in the entire league. It wasn't even remotely in a conversation, and if you wanted to put him at number 1 right now, that's justifiable. Like, he was better than Upset in the series that they played against each other, and that was really a big determining factor. And so if you wanted Kalist above him, I think that that's totally fair. For now, he comes in at number 2, and again, if he does it again, very similar to Vladi, he's going to be moving up to number 1. Targamas is only going to move up to number 4, and part of that is just like his track record really is so bad, and the breakout was real, but he was number 10 for me coming into the year. I just can't put him as like number 1 or number 2 right now. I think Mickey X is definitely better, but if you wanted him above Jun and above Alvaro, I had a brain fart there. If you want him above Jun or Alvaro, I think that that's totally fair. He was better than those players, especially down the stretch in the domestic season. His track record is just worse, and so for now, I'm being a little bit more cautious, but he comes in with a very similar grade to those players, and quite frankly, he's not going to play like the 4th best support in the league, especially if Kalist is still popping off, if Yike is still popping off in the jungle, if Kana is just the best top laner, if Vladi plays like the best mid laner. Like, it's the perfect situation. This team is just so complete right now, and I have a hard time believing that they're going to fall off in the same way that I thought I would rank them falling off going into this split, because they are just really good around the board. Every single one of these players feels like they have hit right now, and K-Corp feels like they have established like a real culture here with this team. So at least for now, K-Corp is going to come in as the team to beat, as the defending champions, and we'll see if they can get dethroned. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC Spring Split 2025 Primer and Power Rankings video. That's all 10 teams done in an overview and analysis style format. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comments. I'm sure that there are definitely some strong or, you know, at least like impassioned beliefs in the comments, and I'm always curious to hear what you guys, you know, have to say. I know the LEC fan base in particular is very passionate when I rank one player one spot too high or one player one spot too low, or a team a little bit too high or too low, so I'm always curious to hear what your thoughts and opinions are down below. But if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We'll be covering every single best of 3 and then eventual best of 5 that happens in the LEC in the spring split. We've already posted the primer version of this video for the LPL and the NACL, which I already said you can check out up in the iCard, but, you know, we'll be covering every single major league week by week here on this channel. So that's the LTA North, that's the LEC, that's the LCK, and it's the LPL. If you're interested in that, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all